Good evening. Welcome to Let Landscape Be Your Guide, a workshop with the Kansas City Veterans Writing Team and Johnson County Library. I am Helen Hokinson. I'm one of the planners for our adult writing programs at the library, and here to welcome you tonight. We are going to be taking a deep dive into landscape. When most people hear the term landscape, they think of geography or a physical landscape. But for writers, it might refer to more than a fixed physical location. It might be a mental or an emotional place that shapes a writer's perspective. So we're going to be diving into that tonight and all day tomorrow. I'd like to briefly introduce Virginia Brackett. She is a member of the Kansas City Veterans Writing Team. She has recently published in the Company of Patriots out of Sunbury Press, and she's published a lot, and so we will hope that you will check out her. She's won our contest 3 times, and so she's very accomplished. And her website, if you want to find more information, is virginiabrackett.com, and that is also in her biography in the engagement tools. So I will hand it over to Virginia for now.
Thank you, Helen. On behalf of the Kansas City Veterans Writing Team, I want to add my welcome to that of Helen's. You'll learn much more about our individual team members tomorrow, but to let you know something about the group, it was founded in order to offer veterans and their family members opportunities to tell their stories in critique groups, in writing workshops like this one, and through readers' theaters. And as we are into our 10th year, we're proud to say that more than 2,000 veterans and family members have taken advantage of those writing opportunities. We're excited to continue that offering with this spring workshop that we have titled Let Landscape Be Your Guide, which is open to the public and free to all thanks to the generosity of Johnson County Library. Again, as noted in the workshop description, the use of the term landscape for our purposes goes far beyond geography or what a writer might think of with the term setting. And so we're excited to begin that discussion of landscape in writing tonight. Helen will introduce our first presenter, Lieutenant Colonel U.S. Army retired Paul Darling, and I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thank you.
So our presenter this evening is Paul Darling. As Virginia said, he's Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Army retired. He lives in Overland Park, Kansas, and is both father and son of combat veterans. A graduate of the United States Military Academy, he has commanded at every level from platoon to regiment. He is the author of Taliban Safari, published by the University Press of Kansas, and his writing has been published in various venues, including Defense News, Proceedings, Military Review, Armed Forces Journal, and
Sweetie, I'm doing this.
All right. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for the invitation to be here. And I have to warn you in that while I'm a published author, it's not because I have any skill set as an author. I basically was in the position to share what is an exceptional story for people who are not experienced in combat. And it was my desire to share that story primarily with my wife, who was the target audience. And then after 10 years, I wrote the book 10 years ago, or 12 years ago now. It took me 10 years before it got published. So the book is not your standard fare. And one of my weaknesses in writing the book is that it is a first-person book, and I am the protagonist. And because I know me, and I love me, and I think I'm absolutely fantastic, I didn't need to write that down. It should have been intuitively obvious to even the casual observer. And of course, my wife married me, and she was very fond of me as well. And when it did get published and was presented to a much larger audience, I realized how, in my desire to share my landscape, which was a physical landscape, the war in Afghanistan, and particularly a small area of it. The subtitle of my book is One Day in the Sirkon Valley. a format stolen shamelessly from Ivan Denisovich, the Solzhenitsyn novel. And as the feedback came in, it's like, I'd like to know more about you. And I just didn't think about writing more about me because I already know me. And it is a weakness in my book. And so I became smarter in what makes a protagonist and how critical it is to have a protagonist as an anchor and as a guide and a relatable individual who can take your reader on a journey into a different world, into a new world, a fascinating world, I would hope. And the world is, to steal from James Bond, the world is not enough. You have to have a good protagonist to take them through. And I was good enough within the book, but I was not as good as I could have been. So here are some things that I've learned as I've studied the art of writing and the science of writing a little bit more. So the best thing to look at various examples is, first, I would say you have to have the idea of the world that you want to share. And that will kind of shape what is the best way of sharing that world. And your skills as an author and your proclivities and how you want to write and how you write characters and how you want to share them is going to determine what kind of protagonist is going to take you through this new world. So, so a fantastic example that most of us should be familiar with is the Harry Potter series. Here you have a magnificently inventive world matched with a fantastic, relatable protagonist in Harry Potter, and one that works at every level. It works for children. It works for adults. I mean, that's capturing magic right there. It's a fantastic model. Harry Potter is relatable. He is, I think that's part of it, is he starts off not being, a wizard. He doesn't even know. He's just a kid who's unhappy. And every kid feels as though they're put upon and so abused. Every child has that feeling. And so that was just a great relatable character. And then there was enough of the adult aspect where even adults could latch on to what was a 6-year-old, 7-year-old character in the book. 50 Shades of Grey is a book I have not read, but as I understand it, it is a very popular book. And it's one in which the world is the world of a billionaire and what it would be like to date one, which I wouldn't mind dating a billionaire of perhaps a different gender, but that's got to be kind of a strange world, a new world. What would it be like to date someone who's ridiculously rich and apparently ridiculously handsome and questionably young for having pulled that off? I'm not sure how many of you are familiar of Diary of a Wimpy Kid. Some of my kids liked it. I have 4 children. And the Diary of a Wimpy Kid is middle school. And it is the middle child of middle school is the protagonist, and we'll talk a little bit more about him. But an utterly mundane world. This is not a book that adults like, but it's interesting for children. And for them, I think a new world is nice, but sometimes they just want to know they're not alone. That what they feel and what they know in the world, it's not uncommon. So here it is the completely average aspect of that world that makes it attractive. Star Wars, I don't know, I assume all of you are at least familiar with it. Again, a fantastic world, very inventive. I remember as a kid going to watch Star Wars at the theater like 20 times in 1977. And I couldn't get enough of that world. And, when you're a kid, you're an idiot. You don't know who, Luke Skywalker. Okay, yeah, he's the main guy, right? And who's this Han guy? I don't know. As you get older, you realize how much more important Han is, and we'll talk about that. The Great Gatsby, I bring up because it's one of those books where the world is that jazz age, those rich people, the world of the ridiculously wealthy living in New England and seeing what that's like. But as we discuss, is Gatsby is the subject of the book, but he's not the protagonist. He's too ethereal a figure to latch onto and to associate with. And so in order to describe Gatsby and his world, you needed Nick Calloway. You needed a different character to do that. And that's a type of protagonist. And we'll talk about that later. Gone with the Wind, the Antebellum South. And then for me, one day in the life of Ivan Denisovich was a novel by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature for the Gulag Archipelago. I've read both. The Gulag Archipelago is a very hard read. It's a long book, first and foremost, and it's brutal. It's hard to digest. And it's completely nonfiction, which makes it even harder. Everything in it is absolutely true. And it's a world that is so foreign, and yet you know that it is real. I did not enjoy reading the Gulag Archipelago. It's not a book I'm ever going to read again, but I've read One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich many times. And it appears as though that taking a real life event, the gulags, and covering them with what I would call the gauze of fiction, it takes the sharp edge off of how bad it was, and it allows the reader, they talk about the suspension of disbelief. In this case, you're suspending the knowledge of the reality, and you're just like, well, it's just a novel, even though you know that everything he's describing is not only true, but not even as bad as it was. But it softens that impact. And I would say that I really like that format because I copied it in my book, which is at the bottom, where there the subject is the war in Afghanistan in 2009 in a place called Sirkagan Valley, which is in the province of Zabul, which means absolutely nothing except to people who were there. And that was my story, and that's what I was fortunate enough to share with my wife and to share with a bigger audience when it got selected for publication. So, a little bit about the protagonist. What do you need? It is a Greek term, and the Greeks basically created the idea of theater, and protagonist was, the etymology is the first competitor. So inherent in that definition of the protagonist, the competitor, there has to be a struggle. It can't just be, hi, this is Skippy, and Skippy went to work and had a great day and went home. You could write that book and you could self-publish it, but it's not going to be a very good book. No one's really going to be interested in a protagonist who doesn't have a struggle in their life and doesn't share that. Now, it doesn't mean it's the primary struggle of the book necessarily, but the protagonist is the one who needs to introduce us to the world and be the first person who brings us within this conflict that's happening. And then the counter to the protagonist is there needs to be an antagonist. It doesn't have to be a person. It could be a situation. It could be anything. But it's the other half of the struggle of the protagonist. It could be you could say it could even be the protagonist themselves struggling against their inner demons. If you ever read the book or saw the movie Fight Club, they constructed in such a sense that the narrator, the protagonist, was also the antagonist in a different person. And if you haven't seen Fight Club, I just ruined the entire movie for you. But come on, it's 25 years old, so I got no pity for you. And one thing to remember, even though the first competitor, the protagonist was not necessarily the hero. In fact, they often were not. So you take the example of Homer and Ilium. It was the Iliad, excuse me. Ilium was the city, Iliad is the book. I should know this. The protagonist was really Odysseus in the first book, but the hero, of course, was Achilles. And then when we did the Odyssey, obviously Odysseus became both the protagonist and the hero. And the key point in the Greek model is the hero, through his heroic actions, and I tragically have to be sexist here because all the heroes were males in these books, and they become divine through his efforts. And it was this great struggle that was overcome and won, and it was so great that he became divine, which provided an example for Greek culture to be heroic and to do those heroic sacrificial acts for the good of Greece, Athens, and the city-states that you came from. So I would say that in the bottom part, I totally have adopted that Greek model, and I will tell you that the protagonist of my book is not a hero. I'm not really sure there is one. It's Afghanistan wasn't a war that really brought out heroism. So the key attributes. You have to relate to the protagonist. And that's part of the problem I find with some books, even some quote unquote nonfiction books. So when you have books about war, Navy SEALs, everyone loves the Navy SEAL books. And, they're very heroic. I can't relate to Superman. I'm not. I need some weaknesses. I need some foibles. I need some depth. I need something I can relate to because they're taking me through a world. And so when I have to be able to kind of put myself in that world, especially in the written format, movies, it's an immersive environment and there's not a lot left to the creativity of the watcher the way there is in the book. So you need to sympathize and relate with that protagonist so that you can have a vested interest in the struggle and you can care about the story and you can also explore the world through their eyes with a sense of relatability. And when you figure out who your audience is, and your audience, you need to identify your audience. Maybe everyone out there is the next J.K. Rowling, and you can write a book and you can write a main character that relates to the entire world and write a world that is fascinating for everyone. Awesome. You don't need me to tell you anything then. But you have to have a target audience. You can have a young adult. You can have women. You can have middle-aged, washed-up old men like me who are trying to pretend that they are reliving some glory days of when they're in the military or wish they were in the military. You got to figure out who you're writing for. And my book was written for my wife. That was my target audience. It was bam, solid. I knew exactly who I was writing for, which was a strength and it made the writing easy. But it was also a weakness in that as I went to a broader audience, that narrow focus left holes in the book that some lament, and I add details that were superfluous, and I left out things that I frankly didn't want to share with my wife. And it's not to say that the book isn't brutally honest, it is, but there's some things she doesn't need to know about me, both by the fact that she already knew it, so telling her again doesn't help, or that she just doesn't need to know, period. And nothing dishonorable as far as the relationship is concerned, but it's tough to figure out exactly what you can share with your family. And then later on, my kids read the book and I didn't edit it for them and figuring out what age was a good time for them. So knowing your target audience, really thinking through it, understanding that, and then understanding that your protagonist has to be relatable to your target audience. If you're writing for young adults and you're writing from the viewpoint of a 50-year-old, I'm not sure that's going to work. It might, if that 50-year-old is maybe reaching back into their memories of what they thought middle school was like or high school was like or whatever. So keep those two things in mind. Who's your audience? And then figure out how you're going to make sure that your protagonist relates to them. The protagonist cannot simply be a spectator. And this gets a little bit complicated as I talk about secondary protagonists a little later on. But they have to have choices. And the reader will put themselves in the protagonist's view. It's like, well, what do you do in this circumstance? And my book does a lot of that. I try very hard to relate in my book what were my choices and the ones that I made and why I made them. And part of the denouement at the end of the book was realizing how many of those choices I got wrong and hoping that the reader would sympathize with the decisions that I made, albeit wrong decisions, but I made them for what were at the time I thought the right reasons. And then maybe as a military audience, and I'd say at least half of my book audience has been military, that they learned something. I was a voracious reader of military memoirs and histories to learn. I was a professional in a profession where mistakes are costly and you don't get to practice them very often. And when you're put in that position where you have to make those decisions and take those actions. If you get it wrong, you or someone else can die. And so you have to do everything you can to learn as much as you can. You can't learn on the fly. You can't learn on the job. Learn as much as you possibly can before you get there. And when I was fortunate enough to get the book published, I had really hoped that it would add to the body of knowledge of the military professional, especially those fighting in small wars and in close infantry combat, that maybe they can glean one small lesson that'll help them in a future war, future battlefield. I don't know that it did or not, but that's certainly my desire. We talked about the struggle. There has to be a possibility that your protagonist doesn't win. And there are books out there where the protagonist doesn't win. It makes for an awkward book. It's kind of a cheap shot. And I don't particularly like stories where my protagonist loses. I like the protagonist. If it's a good protagonist, I don't want to be a loser. Why would I want to read a book about where the guy I like, the person I identify with, dies? Well, that's no fun. So, so J.K. Rowling kind of had those cheap shots. Again, I'm going to do a spoiler alert in the last book where she kills Harry and then brings her back to life. I'm like, come on, that was a cheap shot. Come on, that was cheap. You're better than this. I might have said she's like a billionaire. And then multidimensional. You just can't have these stone-jawed, gods of war in these Navy SEAL books. It's not real. No one's that good except for my wife. She's perfect. But I mean, aside from that, no one's that good. So these are some traditional things, the stoic, the comedic, the heroic, and these strengths and weaknesses. I was very open about my weaknesses in the physical sense. Afghanistan was a physically exhausting battlefield. It was high altitude, it was mountainous, it was hot, and maybe too much of the book focuses on that part of the environment. But we talk about the antagonist. I'll tell you, the environment was as much an antagonist as Taliban in the book. It was tough. In going back to Homer, when the rage of Achilles, he was half god, dipped in the river Styx by his mother, but still he just went into this fearsome rage that ruined the well-laid plans, and the rage, anger is a reaction to fear, and the idea that this demigod of Achilles could fear something and to have the rage, it shows a dimension to him. He was confident, he was totally in control, and then his friend dies, and then he's a different character. It shows dimensions. And when you're talking about a character like Achilles, who is a demigod, to give depth to that is difficult. And I guess Homer used a little trick there to make that happen, but we're still talking about it 3,000 years later, so obviously the trick worked well. Should the protagonist be funny? I think so. I like humor. I like to think I'm somewhat humorous. And I don't know, humor is intelligent. If you can see the absurd of the environment, humor reflects the absurd. So when you write your world, there should be some sort of a sense of the absurd, because it's a new world. It's different, and then the humor in the book and the characters should reflect the absurdity of the situation they find themselves in. And there's a lot of jokes in my book, and this is infantry combat, but there's always something, I think, funny. Maybe I find things a little too funny. You can ask my various bosses, and again, my wife, and they'll confirm I might find too many things funny and too many inappropriate things funny. Helen, you left me an inbox. My apologies. I'll tell you, before we kick off on this, because I did promise to answer questions as we went through some of my favorite military histories. I am a sucker for the Greeks. I love Xenophon. I love Thucydides. I like not only the histories, but I also like the Homer, the heroic. I like Herodotus. I love the ancient Greeks. I wish I was classically educated so I could read them in the Greek. I'm completely dependent upon the translations. And so that carries on. I like Vegetius. I like Caesar's commentaries, especially his Gallic commentaries. Josephus, his history. Um, I have some niche campaigns that I find interesting. I really enjoy reading about the Arab-Israeli wars as well as the Falklands campaigns, and then the conflict in Zimbabwe, Rhodesia. Those are some wars, some more modern wars that provide lessons, and I find interesting. And then as a child, I was captured by World War II. The vast scale of the conflict. You could, it is an awe-inspiring. It is an awesome conflict, just on the pure scale, the horrific nature, and how many people were impacted and frankly just killed by it. And it wasn't that long ago. I mean, it was on a scale like the greater than the Greek novels, or greater than Alexander, and greater than Caesar's. It was the greatest war in history. I mean, great in the literal sense, rather than being a fantastic time and let's all go barbecue on Omaha Beach. So, what would I suggest for readers new to military literature? I would focus on anything that you have a personal attraction to, that you would want to learn about it based upon your descent. If you come from an Irish or Italian background, you come from an African background, and then something that you find interesting that you want to learn about, and then delve in deep and become, I tell this to my lieutenants, become an expert on a war that no one else knows about. And people will be interested in it. They want to hear about it, and then know the characters, and not only the main characters, but then start getting the secondary and the tertiary characters. And just the human scale of war. We talk about you have to have a conflict in the book. War is the ultimate conflict. And I enjoy all kinds of reading, but I would say 90% of my reading is nonfiction, and not necessarily war, but just I love history. And history is really just a catalog of conflict as cultures clashed and ideas were battled against each other in the ultimate debating field. And World War II is a personification of that. You had fascism, and you had the communists, and you had the West. So, anyways, hope that covers that question. My apologies for missing that. I was too busy battling. So, we talked about the protagonist, and generally the protagonist is the main subject of the book, but every now and then you have some exceptions. So the protagonist in Sherlock Holmes is Watson, but he's not the main subject, of course. Holmes is, but I think Holmes is too fantastic a figure. He's too smart. He's just kind of like too perfect. I could not relate to Sherlock Holmes as much as I'd like to. But Watson, I certainly related to. Watson was just a good person, but he was always just, oh my God, Holmes, how did you do that? Which is, if I had a friend like Sherlock Holmes, I'd be like, Holmes, how did you figure that out? And so when you have a character, and don't get me wrong, I love Sherlock Holmes, fantastic character, but is he the right guide for your reader? Obviously, Doyle did not think so, and the success of the book would indicate that he made the right call. If you took away Watson from the Sherlock Holmes stories, what would you be left with? I think you lose it. I think you need a protagonist to explain Holmes to you. And he shared in Holmes's adventures. He was part of the struggle. And sometimes he was the key point. And Watson provided the requisite effort for Holmes and Watson working together to be successful. But I absolutely agree with using Watson as the supporting protagonist, and primarily as the guide of the world of Sherlock Holmes. Nick Calloway, we talk about that, The Great Gatsby, very relatable character. I think anyone can understand when you feel out of place around an impressive bunch of people. When I was doing my recruiting trip, and I was looking at going to some very overly prestigious schools in the East, I totally related with Nick Calloway. I could not understand the world of people who came from like old New England. It was just, I grew up with not so much in Nevada. And these guys are, if you can't trace your lineage to 1500 in New England, well, welcome to the New Americans. And then Bilbo Baggins, not a great example of the supporting protagonist's guide. But he was explaining this fantastic world of the Shire, and then of course you follow that up with the Lord of the Rings and Frodo. Same idea. Frodo was the next generation of Bilbo, literally the next generation. And so, if your world involves a character who's so magnificent, so splendiferous, and so regal that your reader can't connect to them, then you need to look at developing the supporting protagonist with the idea of being the guide. And I think it's a fantastic literary device and one that works really well. So then you have the villain as protagonist. And I give some examples. So you got Tony Montana, of course, from Scarface. We got the Joker, and two different Jokers, but I'm speaking more of the Joaquin Phoenix version that just came out. Patrick Bateman from American Psycho, Alex DeLarge from A Clockwork Orange, Richard III from Shakespeare, and Greg Heffley is the protagonist in Diary of a Wimpy Kid. And I mentioned that one. It's weird to have a villain protagonist in a children's book. You could say young adult, but I'm going to say it's a child's book. It's a cartoon. And the author of the books, I can't remember his name right now, he said Greg Heffley, the character, was everything that was wrong about him in middle school. He's a terrible kid. He's narcissistic. He's selfish. He's manipulative. He's an abject liar about everything. And so my kids read it. They love the books. And I'm like, all right, fine, I'm going to read one. I'm like, this guy's terrible. Why are my kids associating with? And it's because when you're young, these are natural things. Hey, if I lie, I get out of this. You have to break yourself of this. So in developing a villainous protagonist in a young adult book, you tell kids, yes, people have these feelings, and the success, your arc as an individual, not necessarily the protagonist arc, is to realize these are wrong. It's okay to have these feelings, but you have to conquer them. You have to beat them. You have to have your own personal arc. Doesn't mean I like the books anymore, but if the lessons are learned that just because he's the protagonist, but he's not a good guy, but he can guide you through this world and get you your own personal arc as a development, well, okay, I got it. And, they've had like 3 movies, maybe 4, I don't know, and tons of books, and he's really rich and I'm not. So obviously the guy was onto something. And I highlight all of these that, Richard III was from Shakespeare, largely visual mediums. I'm not sure how well a villain as a protagonist works in a purely written form. So I mention these as examples of famous examples, and I'm sure they're out there as an author. However, I think it may detract from the criticality. When you're in a visual medium, the world is presented to you. It's much easier to immerse yourself in. You can literally hear it. You can literally see it. Whereas in a purely written form, you're going to be stuck with having to imagine it. And I think maybe having a protagonist villain would be a bridge too far for something that is not a visual medium. And having that negative arc where you associate and you like this protagonist and you want to see them succeed in a good way, and they don't. The arc goes the wrong way. They lose that struggle, at least with themselves. And, Tony Montana, of course, dies in the end, and we know how it ends for Richard III. And Alex DeLarge from Clockwork Orange, he succeeds in the end. And it's terrible. You're a humble narrator. And, it's like, he wins? Really? Really? Are we doing this? And it's a powerful mechanism, but it's one that I don't fully understand. And I would say it's out there. And if you think it works for you, you write your book and you tell your story. And if you can pull it off, when it works, it's amazing to see when you can get someone to relate to the villain and not feel bad about themselves. I would feel really bad if I watched A Clockwork Orange or American Psycho or Tony Montana and yet, oh yeah, I would totally do that. That's the way I would go. I'm not sure I'd want to see that reflected myself. So this brings me to my book. So most of you are probably not looking at kind of writing a book like I do, and understand that I just wrote it. I read a lot of books, but I was not trained in any regard in writing. I became an author. So I wrote the book. No one cared. It went nowhere. My wife cared. And so I started writing professional articles and relating the stories in smaller formats, and I wrote dozens of them, and some of them did quite well. And it was through that, building that platform of academic writing, that I was able to get published in academic press. But I wasn't a trained author, and the book reflects that. Anyway, so we talked about it. It came from Ivan Denisovich, and the key point for me was it was one singular day, from the time I woke up to the time I went to bed. And it allowed me to focus very much, and it gave it a really tight timeline. It worked very well for what I was trying to do. I am not interesting enough to try to tell you more than one day of my life. And even that one day, when you read the book, and I assume that you will, you'll find out even that one singular day was still a lot of boring stuff going on. You spend a lot of time driving around in a Humvee in the desert. And if you can kind of see in the background, that's the Circagon Valley behind me. And I spent a lot of time in Circagon Valley, not just that one day. That's where I fought. And that's where my struggles were. And war provides an inherent struggle. So the academic press was nice, but you do need a platform. And so for me, my platform was I was a veteran, and I had a couple dozen articles that were published in professional journals. The platform means, why should anyone publish you? In the nonfiction world, it's very important. If you're a four-star general, you're a four-star general. Someone's going to publish that book. It's probably going to suck, and no one's going to read it except for maybe other four-star generals. But that's your platform. I am not that guy. I am not a Navy SEAL. I am not Special Forces. I am not cool. I'm not famous. I don't have lots of medals. I'm just a guy. So to get published in that, you have to have a different kind of platform. And mine was professional writing, and then the recommendation of people who've been published before. As mentioned, I wrote the book in 1 year. I knew exactly what I wanted to write. I knew the day. I knew how the book was going to start. I knew how it was going to finish. I knew all the chapters. And then I basically wrote a chapter a month, and I told myself I had to be done in a year, because otherwise the story would change, my memory would fade, and it wouldn't be honest. And so for me, it was, since I was writing this for my wife, it was absolutely critical that it be as honest as possible. And then I got lucky. It took 7 years to build a platform, and even with 7 years and all those articles, I got completely lucky because someone just read through my article and then was interested enough to devote the time to read the book and then help me get published. And then even after I got it to the publisher, and they're like, yes, we're going to publish, it was another 18 months to publish after I got through the initial review process, and then the edits and the rewrites and going through the readers to get it okay, because in an academic press, you have to have a board of readers read your book and say, yeah, this is something that adds to the body of knowledge. I am the author and I am the protagonist. I talk about my audience. I so wanted to immerse my wife as the reader into this book. I originally wrote it in the second person, which didn't work, but it worked for me. It's kind of how I thought. You did this, and then you got up, and you gave the orders, and blah blah blah. Very awkward, but that was how much I wanted to immerse the reader into my world, is to make it a second person so that they got that. The struggle, it's combat, so the struggle is there. I am multidimensional. I am 3D. I can turn sideways, as you can see. But the point is, I make a lot of mistakes. I do a lot of things right. I get angry. I have moments of calm. I have empathy towards my enemy, the Taliban, and at the same time trying to hunt them down and kill as many as I can. I get frustrated with the civilians, but I feel great pity for the situation that they're in, and I have a lot of admiration for the manner in which they live their lives. So it's not, I mean, we're all multidimensional. It's not like it's some great accomplishment, but by writing with myself as the protagonist, I know my strengths and weaknesses. I may overstate my strengths occasionally, but I do know my strengths and weaknesses. And so the character was multidimensional. And as mentioned, I'm not a hero. I do some stupid stuff, but it's not heroic. But I'm not the anti-hero either. And I try to do the right things. I'm not trying to break the rules. I'm fighting a war as best I can. And with a mutually exclusive set of objectives that, one, I got to bring all my people home, but the other half is I have to kill some other people. And in order to kill them, I have to put these people whose safety I care about, I have to put them at risk. I have to go and put them in danger at the exact same time that I'm trying to keep them alive. So it's complex, but it's not an anti-hero kind of thing. I don't know. I couldn't pull that one off. It's not who I am. And I'm not the supporting protagonist per se, but I do try to highlight that I'm just a regular guy. I'm not Superman here. I'm not a hero. I'm just a soldier. And I think the book has done well among soldiers because they can, even though I'm kind of weak in developing myself as the protagonist for the reasons I talked earlier, they can understand where a soldier comes from. So the people who are not soldiers who've read the book, the feedback has always been, I wish we knew more about you. The people who are soldiers and came back, the feedback was, I really would have liked to have learned more about the other soldiers you were with. So it's different feedback from different audiences, and this goes back to knowing who your target audience is and writing for them. I had a million antagonists, people who are trying to stop me in my struggle. And these are just, and yeah, the Taliban, it's Taliban Safari. I would put them like maybe fourth on this list behind the climate and the terrain in the United States Air Force. And maybe I put the Air Force as my primary antagonist. And if you read the book, you understand my frustration. But there's a whole list of people who are after me trying to stop me. So consider that. Consider you don't need one antagonist. Maybe that simplifies it. Maybe it would have been a better book if I had focused on that. But the fact is, there was all sorts of things working against me and what my struggle was and what I was trying to do. So we talk about the classic Greek. I did not know classic Greek structure when I wrote this book. And then later on, I did some studying on how to write and whatnot. And then I learned some more. So there's a lot of hubris on my part. There's a ex machina solution that came out of nowhere that solved one of my problems. It really happened, but there's a situation within the book, and the situation was I captured a prisoner and the Afghans executed him, and then the guy who executed ended up dying just a little while later. So what am I going to do about this Afghan? Well, the God in the machine took care of that, and so it took care of what was the problem. I had agoneresis. I had the revelation, but I never had the peripeteia. I never had the reversal. I realized at the end the fruitlessness of what I had done that day, and in retrospect, what we had done in Afghanistan. But there's no reversal in who I was. It just kind of opened my eyes. There were some cathartic moments. There was a climax, third act, middle of the book. That's the climax. And then you have denouement, which for me ended up being a phone call with my wife, which is how the book ended. And it was the reason I wrote the book was, I can't describe to her what happens in a day, especially a day like this. But, I wound down and talked to my wife and chilled out and relaxed. That was kind of how we brought it all down. So the book followed without my knowing it, just a classic Greek structure. The only difference is I'm no Homer, and I couldn't describe Ilium, the city, quite the way he did. So that's my book. I hope if anyone's on here, you guys would enjoy it. Okay, so sorry, Virginia. I'm not real good at this. I missed some of these questions. So Virginia asked, for people who haven't read the book, which is for everyone if you've seen the sales, how do I help readers relate to the foreign location of Afghanistan? I guess just because I describe it. And for me, the children of Afghanistan are universal. Children are children. And there's a lot of children in Afghanistan. And I realize, I hadn't really thought about it till now, the children are the common theme. They laugh about the same things. They laugh in the same ways. They care about the same things. They have the bright, curious faces. And they don't know enough of the tragedy that they're surrounded by to be unhappy. As long as they've got food and love, they're happy. And so I use the children and I just am realizing this now, I use the children as the anchor that allowed any audience to relate. And then the rest is, I spent a lot of time in the book describing the environment. And all of it comes back to, when I was in Kandahar, it looked like Las Vegas, where I grew up. The place where I thought reminded me of the high desert in Utah. And I spent a lot of time describing it in terms that most Americans, or American audience, would be familiar with. So I've been around the world. I've been in a lot of countries, and all of them remind me of some other place that I've been. People are people, and mountains are mountains, and trees are trees, and deserts are deserts. You look back there, that could be a scene from, like I said, from Utah or New Mexico or something like that. So I take the time to kind of describe the terrain and the environment and the countryside in a way that would be related to people who are vaguely familiar with American geography. Do I journal? No, I do not journal. This is my journal. I read a lot, but I don't journal. And I guess this is my memoir for my family, and that's all they get. If they want anything more, they can ask me questions. And so my apologies. That's my presentation. That's what I've got. I'm sorry. I meant to answer the questions as they came up, but I missed it in the inbox because I was looking at the slides and looking at the camera, and I'm not really good with this format. So that's all I have. I greatly appreciate this time who's on here.
So we have a few minutes left. If you don't mind, I wanted to ask you about some of the things you talked about. You said you wrote the book first in second person and it didn't work. Had you written the entire book in second person before you realized that was, and then how long? And so that was a year. And then how long did it take you what made you realize it didn't work? And how long did it take you to rewrite it?
So a friend of mine, someone who I co-authored some of my professional papers, he'd read the book and he's like, I get what you're going for. And he was Jesuit educated. He had a classical education that I was lacking. West Point does not teach you what a Jesuit school would. And so he read it. He's like, look, this is a good story, but this doesn't work, dude. If you really want to go to a wider audience, you have to do this in first person. Third person was impossible. I could not write about myself in the third person. I'm an egomaniac, but I'm not that much of an egomaniac. First, I just had to read. And the funny thing is, I was too lazy to rewrite it from scratch. Primarily, I would tell you that I didn't want to rewrite it from scratch because I would introduce things after the fact that weren't true. So I wanted to maintain the honest voice of the book that was written so close to the events. So there are still artifacts in the book, in the final published version, of how I wrote it in the second person. So now it's like an Easter egg for people who know me, that when they read the book, they're like, okay, I'm going to find where he screwed this up. And it's like, aha, I found it. And when you guys publish a book and you go through a traditional publisher, you will become so sick and tired of reading it. Oh my gosh, I don't know how many times I've read my book. I hate my book, and I'm the subject of it.
So you had, you were talking with Virginia a little bit before we started the recording about how you ended up with an academic publisher. Can you talk a little bit about that?
The person who read the book, who had the platform, who had been published before, who got me introduced, he said, look, you've got two ways you can go with this. You can get published by the Fanboy Press, and he had published through Fanboys. And the Fanboy Press, I use that disparagingly. There's a huge market for war books, primarily from middle-aged has-beens like myself, who want to read about a war they weren't a part of, most of them. And they're the fanboys. They eat up the SEAL books and the SF books and, Danger Close, the story of the world's deadliest SEAL. I'm like, oh, Jesus. Okay, well, that's not me. He's like, and he said, or we can go with academic. I think that because this is, one, you have an academic background in your publishing, but two, this really does add to the body of knowledge as far as a military memoir with lessons learned for future readers. This isn't just entertainment. This is a repository of lessons learned in combat. And so I talked with him, and there's advantages and disadvantages with both. I decided to try with the academic press. If it hadn't worked, I would have gone to the fanboy press. But the editor liked it enough, and the readers they sent it out to for review liked it enough that they picked it up. And the big advantage for the academic press is, one, it is more prestigious. And as mentioned earlier, I'm an egomaniac. And two, it stays in publication for much, much longer. Once your sales drop off on the fanboy press, you're dropped, you're gone. Whereas an academic press will keep that in publication for decades. And that appealed to me.
Yeah, nice. Is there anything that were there any lessons that surprised you? In these 10 years of putting this book together, was there anything that was you were just kind of gobsmacked by?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, there was. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'll tell you what gobsmacked me. So once you sign with the publisher, it's not your book. I got that. So they sold the rights to the audiobook for it, and they never told me. And the audiobook was done before they ever told me. And I do a lot of public speaking. I'm a pretty good speaker. I really wanted to read my book if they were going to do an audiobook. I had no idea that were going to go to an audiobook. I didn't think that was a thing with academic presses, especially for a first-time author. And they're like, oh, by the way, your check will be coming. We sold the rights for the audiobook. I'm like, oh, can I talk to him? I really wanted to read it. And the guy who took care of it wasn't Joyce, the publisher. It was their marketing or business sales or whatever. And he's like, oh, they're already done with it. I'm like, oh. And I don't want to talk. I don't like how they read the book. I don't like it. One, he pronounces everything wrong, every single word in Pasha. He does. So they never even contacted me. Like, how do you say Circagon? And so they mispronounce every word in it. And this is the thing with books on tape is the reader's supposed to be very monotone. That's not who I am. And I'm the protagonist. It's first person. I know how this book should have been read, and I had no say in it. And so, yeah, that surprised me. I was a little tweaked on that one, but I did get a check for it.
Wait till they sell the movie rights, then you'll really get gobsmacked.
By the time that happens, like everyone who I have an idea should play everyone. They're going to be too old. If it wasn't going to be me reading the book, I was hoping for Gilbert Godfrey. I think he would have been fantastic. But tragically, he passed away, so he'll no longer be available.
All right. Well, I don't see any more questions in the Q&A, and we're getting close to our time. So I want to invite everyone back in the morning for our workshop with Paul. We'll be following that with a lecture from Mark Turcotte, and then a workshop with Mark Turcotte. So lots of writing. And then we'll have a conversation with Paul, Mark, and H.C. Palmer, who's one of the members of the Kansas City Veterans Writing Team, moderated by Virginia. So we hope to see you all at some point during the day tomorrow. We're going to wrap everything up with an open mic. So you can bring something that you produced during the workshops, which is kind of vulnerable because it will be, a first draft, but that's okay. And then we would love to see your writing entered in our writing contests. And then save the date. Our yearly writers conference will be November 17th to November 20th. So mark your calendar. Take your vacation from work and don't schedule a vacation. So, all right, we will see you all in the morning. Good night.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Bye.